So I'm here with Richard Crook from RBS, the famed Richard Crook. It's great to have you with us on FinTech Insider. Why don't you tell us what you do at RBS?
So Simon, great to be here. It's a fantastic view for those who can't see it. I run a high energy team of engineers and innovators who are currently both helping the customers and our bank from innovation point of view, and also from disrupting inside the fintech space. We're broadly looking at themes around AI, cloud infrastructure, APIs, and of course, blockchain.
Ah, that old chestnut. So how did you discover that old chestnut we call blockchain?
So this takes us back. This is great. We entered a Deloitte digital hackathon back in November 2014, and I took a small team over there, and we backed Royal Bank of Scotland's wholesale FX trading desk, the FX micropay product, into the Ripple network, and started to discover what it would be like to be a market maker in that space, and that exposed us to all the different digital currencies that were rolling around inside the Ripple consensus network at the time. We came away with the first prize on that, and that kind of catapulted us into the innovation wing of the bank, where we have been running the blockchain lab ever since.
Very, very cool. And so when you're going into that hackathon, what was kind of the thesis behind why you're going to try and do FX and digital currencies? What did you learn, and what did you want to learn going into it? Was it just kind of experience the unknown?
Interestingly enough, it's taken us on a journey which has built an internal product we call an innovation spike, which takes a new technology with an old business problem, and we marry those up, 4 days, 4 or 5 engineers, a subject matter expertise, and that gives us usually a jolt of corporate knowledge. It lifts us. We normally don't go in with a hypothesis, and even if we do, as soon as the engineers fan out and learn, the hypothesis immediately gets turned over and we start looking at new things. So the hackathon, we discovered very quickly there's no liquidity, there's loads of currencies, many more than you can ever write down. And as soon as you start taking something like a wholesale trading desk in there with access to the wholesale prices, you immediately see that the spreads are absolutely off. And that's because there's no liquidity, or there's now liquidity, but there wasn't in those days, and that gave us a huge learning around how immature this space was when we started.
It's like a frog trying to swallow a shark. It's not going to happen when you've got something very, very large trying to use something very, very small, but who knows, maybe that changes. And talk to me a little bit more about the spikes, because I've heard the terminology of sprints in Agile a lot, and a lot of banks are talking about being agile, being lean. How's a spike different? Like, what are you measuring there? What are you trying to achieve with spikes?
So you take a sprint. Most people are comfortable with an agile sprint, it's 2 weeks. The terminology around a spike, again, the agile community is aware that if you have something that's technically hard, there's some risk around that, technology risk around that. You may take 1 or 2 engineers, or one engineer who might do a bit of extreme programming and pair up to try and de-risk that challenge before they then put it back on the backlog and they now understand how much it's going to cost. So it's quite a normal thing. What we did was kind of scale that into, actually, if we take some top-end engineers for a very small amount of time, not enough that they're going to build something that you wouldn't be prepared to throw away, but short enough time, so long enough that they've got time to build something. It changes the dynamic of the conversation, where you may be used to the sort of 40-man workshops where you're all sitting there talking about things you don't understand. Actually, if you turn up with a working prototype that you've built in 4 days with some new tech, the conversation changes, because the old adage of code wins arguments, it's really easy to have a conversation or an argument if you've actually got the solution, and the naysayers are immediately silenced. So that's the construct of it, and from our perspective, it's been very successful in leaping us forward internally on some of these new technologies as they've emerged.
I think leaping is an interesting word. Seeing is believing. Definitely, when you see something, it becomes a lot more real. And then also when you kind of take that leap, instead of taking 2 to 3 months to figure out what bit of code are we going to write to learn something, you actually admit that you don't know something really early on. You do perform a spike, learn very quickly, and then when you do go into the 2-month process, you've got a lot more information and you're not having to repeat that 2-month process 2 or 3 or 4 times just to get learnings out of it.
Absolutely, and for those poor souls who are still looking at the kind of waterfall Prince2 type mentality and are lost at this point, this is, from an enterprise program perspective, technology de-risking. So it'll be on your risk log, it's there, it's a technology risk. Actually, let's go send some people off to work in a very small effort to come back and mitigate that risk. So it works in both practices.
So speaking of new technologies then, the subject this week for FinTech Insider is all about blockchain. And I guess I'm curious to know, what are your current thoughts on the state of blockchain and what's needed for it to be successful? There's a lot of people saying, oh, it's a solution looking for a problem. Is this your view? Do you think there's a current state out there that's changing and evolving? Will it become useful? A lot of questions.
There are a lot of questions. Yeah, I'm pleased with the current state of, you call it blockchain, I would call it the distributed ledger technologies. I think if you separate the concerns and we look at the technology layer, that's broadly converging. No vendor has taken or become king. And what we're seeing is a good open source community growing, maturing. The recent hacks on Ethereum only strengthen that community as we all learn from that. We are seeing broad and strong collaboration between the players, competitors and clients alike. There has now been a broad move to focus on business problems rather than the technology for technology's sake. And last but not least, I think the debate is now moving towards, if you look at some of the original blockchain use cases, and the experiment in Bitcoin is a good example, the decentralized business model that you and I have spoken about on Twitter is now coming back into focus, because actually you're paid to be part of the network in Bitcoin, and that is how you get paid. That's how it becomes a decentralized model. And one of the things we're trying to encourage in the collaborations is not to recreate these centralized entities, because actually we've got to create decentralized business models. And we've got to work out as an industry how to be paid to run these decentralized models. We're not going to do it for free. Our clients don't expect that, and they certainly wouldn't wish us to. What they want us to do is run a very safe, trusted network, and for us to be remunerated reasonably for doing so. And that is the next debate.
Super interesting. You talked a lot about business models there and business model change. And when people say a solution looking for a problem, you talked about solving real business problems. Can you give us an example that makes it real in financial services? Like, talk about the problem today and then talk about how some sort of distributed ledger tech would start to alleviate that problem.
Yeah, and the easiest one for that is by far the biggest one. We spent about a decade, or the previous decade, removing back office cost in the large investment wholesale banks. And to a greater or less extent, what that was the convergence of sources of truth inside these large banks, be it the counterparties that we're trading with, be it the trading calendars. It can be anything, but you're trying to make sure that you don't have two versions of the truth. Because if you do, you've then got a competition inside, you've got better still reconciliations. And these little large reconciliation industries, cottage industries that have grown inside the wholesale banks, have been eradicated to a greater or less extent within the bank. Now we have a technology that is starting to show the ability for us to come to consensus between two of these banks. And I always use the adage of the man with two clocks. The regulator receives daily huge tracts of data from each of the regulated entities around the world, and those data sets should add up. There's only so many trades, and they should concur, or at least net off, and they don't. So the regulator finds himself there with two sets of data on a daily basis, and he's like a man with two clocks. He doesn't know the time. Mm-hmm. If you get to a position and we're not talking tomorrow, if you get to a position where there is a single source of truth between those two banks, and the regulator is reading from that single source of truth, the onus for the regulator to come to the banks and ask for that data goes away, because there is this single source of truth that the regulator can source from. That will eradicate a huge back office cost, and that is where you will see the focus over the next few years.
Huge back office cost, but also potentially take a lot of risk out of the system, right? So if the regulators can see what's really going on, then perhaps they at least have one view now. It doesn't mean they'll necessarily catch everything, prevent everything, but that's a better position than they're in today.
Having spent a huge amount of time doing regulatory reporting out of one of the back of these big banks, every business case is based upon the risk profile on the balance sheet. So however millions you're going to spend on the program, it's always orders of magnitude more on the benefits case, and that may be people, and there is always a people play in terms of the cost efficiencies, but in terms of the capital liquidity that you have to hold on your balance sheet because of the, as you say, risk in the system, it's massive, it's huge, and it makes these business cases very easy for the regulatory reporting programs.
So you said it's not going to happen tomorrow. What are we going to see over the next 3, 5, 10 years? Is this stuff real? Is it something that people should be paying attention to?
I think if we look out over 3 to 5 years, where there is business cases around consensus, where we're trying to converge on consensus, this is where it's going to work. And I think if you look at what we are expecting over the next 10 years, we should hope to see an open standard, an open network, open access for people to use, much like the public internet protocol, IP internet that we have today. We will undoubtedly see the emergence of large platforms on top of that network, and hopefully those platforms won't own that technology layer beneath, and the best examples of those are things like Amazon and Google in the internet, and the new ones for this blockchain networks will emerge. And then finally, we want to make sure that there is ability for new entrants to come in and disrupt. Things like Instagram is a great example of, because there is an open access to that technology layer, the public IP, the internet, Instagram can exist, can compete with the Googles and the Amazons, and we'd want to see the same inside this new arena.
So that's really quite radical, isn't it? I mean, if you think about financial services today, there's this very closed world that only banks can operate in. And to hear somebody say that it's good for innovation, good for banks to be able to invite more people in, seems like not what you think banks would want. Is there a business case there for opening this up? What's the rationale for a bank to be on more open platforms? Is there more to it than just reducing back office cost? Are there other opportunities that start to come on the back of it?
I think you start with the customer. You always start with the customer. The customer is demanding better services, and for them to demand better services, we need to respond. And in the way we want to respond, we are tied to quite a lot of incumbent industries and utilities and technology that a lot comes out on. Actually, what we want to see is the innovation throughout that industry, in those incumbent industries and those utilities, to get us to a position where we can deliver to our customers better services.
Fantastic. And so for our listeners, if they want to find out more about RBS on innovation, where would they go?
So I think what you've seen over the last year is a whole series of hackathons. Those are public events. People can come in, see a bank innovating and working with the fintech community, people like yourself, Simon. And bankofapis.com is the new portal attracting fintechs and hackathons participants alike, and that gives you a view of where we're going with our open innovation.
Fantastic. Bankofapis.com. Make sure you get there. Richard, thank you very much.
Simon, thank you.